You can't have a situation where you've just stepped out of public life as a political elected representative or an advisor and then straight on to the AAT. There's got to be some break. That's not being discussed at the moment, and I think that's really important to put that on the table, that we need to have exclusion periods, particularly in relation to bodies like the AAT, that at their very essence it's about them being independent and impartial.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're going to revisit some important Australia Institute research from a few months ago on cronyism in appointments to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. You might have heard the Attorney-General in the news recently because he introduced the legislation to establish a National Anti-Corruption Commission. But that isn't the only thing that he announced since taking office. At the end of June, Mark Dreyfus announced that he was conducting a review of the operations of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or the AAT, to make sure that it's fit for purpose, and he also committed to a transparent and merit-based appoint system for the AAT.
And will conduct a sweeping review of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal amid threats by the government for a radical shake-up.
A review of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and changes to whistleblower protections.
Labor tells 7 News the tribunal has been stacked with at least 57 Liberal or National-linked candidates in recent years. Their combined salaries up to $14 million.
For the past decade, the Coalition has been accused of stacking the Administrative Appeals Tribunal with former MPs and advisors.
We're seeing a kind of a radical reshaping of the AAT.
Similarly, for the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, we need to see merits-based appointments that will serve Australia better.
How can we do this better? Is our current process in Parliament working for the Australian people?
I am going to be fully reviewing the operations of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to make sure that it is fit for purpose, to make sure that it is working at the optimum level.
Now that in itself doesn't sound controversial at all, but the reason why he needs to conduct a review is that just prior to the election, the Australia Institute released the largest and most comprehensive domestic study of the practice of cronyism in relation to appointments to a government agency ever conducted. And it found there was a sharp rise in the proportion of political appointments to the AAT, in particular during the Coalition government's most recent period in office. So to discuss this important research, I'm delighted to introduce the lead author of the report, Deb Wilkinson. She's an expert in the study of cronyism and is completing her doctorate at the Australian National University. And joining her is Bill Brown, head of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program. G'day, Deb. G'day, Bill.
Hello.
Deb, if I can begin with you, for those of us who aren't experts in cronyism, what is it and why is it important that we talk about it? Why is it a problem, generally speaking?
Okay, so cronyism refers to the appointment of friends and political associates to a range of positions, but in this case it's in relation to a statutory agency. And the issue is about the preferential treatment, and the issue as well is about do the people actually have the right qualifications? So sometimes cronyism will result in people who are highly experienced, but other times they're not at all. And we see that in this case.
Yeah, and so it's a bit like why nepotism is bad, just appointing your friends and family to positions. You might not have the qualifications for the job.
Absolutely. And there's also, at issue too, is the flow-on effects. And that goes beyond the research here. But in other countries, it's been well documented that it leads to other forms of corruption as well.
Mm.
Because if you place people in positions of power, if you place people into positions where they've got control of government decision making, they can use that power to affect a whole range of outcomes that are not in the public interest.
Mm.
So it's not just about the initial appointment that's the bad thing in terms of the preferential treatment. It's also about what comes next.
Yeah. So cronyism, generally speaking, pretty bad, not endorsed as a method of appointing people to important government bodies.
No, that's right.
The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or AAT, reviews decisions made by Australian government ministers and departments and other organisations under Commonwealth laws.
Bill, before we kind of get stuck into the numbers, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the AAT, it gets mentioned a lot, but people might not be familiar with exactly what it does. What does the AAT do?
The Administrative Appeals Tribunal is responsible for the merits review of government decisions. So if you think that the government's made the wrong decision, whether it's for a visa application or a freedom of information request or a decision like that, you can go to the AAT and they'll actually reconsider the evidence and make a correct decision. That might be the same one that the government made in your case, or it might be a different one. And if you look through the kinds of issues that the AAT considers, a lot of them are pretty much life or death situations. Things like immigration, child support, taxation, veterans' entitlements, things that really go to the heart of you being able to live your life. And that's why it's so concerning if the AAT isn't able to make the best decision possible.
Yeah, so it's making a lot of consequential decisions, Deb, that can really affect a person's whole life.
The decisions the AAT most commonly reviews relate to child support, family assistance and social security, visas, the NDIS, taxation, veterans' entitlements, and workers' compensation for employees covered by Commonwealth laws. We are independent of the person or department that made the original decision, and we aim to make our review process accessible, fair, just, economical, informal, and quick.
So what did your research show has happened to the appointments process over time?
We looked at 974 appointments to the AAT from...
Sorry, well, 974.
Yes, 974, and I've got to say my eyesight is a lot worse since having done this research. So that went back all the way back to 1996, the beginning of the Howard era, right through to just before the election this year. And the research showed that there's been a huge escalation in the number of political appointees in the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison era. So in the Howard era, it was 6% of all appointees were political appointees, 5% in the Rudd-Gillard era, so, roughly the same. But then it jumps very substantially to 30% in the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison era. And within that era, it's actually also ramping up. So it's 40% of all appointees in the second Morrison administration.
Right. So that's a pretty dramatic jump towards the end there in the data. And if you can just tell me, sorry again, over what period of time were you focused there? It's from the beginning of when John Howard was elected PM?
As soon as John Howard was elected, all appointments from then right up until I think it was March 2022.
So that's pretty comprehensive as a study.
Oh, absolutely. And I look for the PhD. I've been doing lots of research on what's been done in different countries, and I've never come across a piece of research that's looked at so many appointees.
Yeah, almost 1,000 appointees.
That's right. So it's pretty compelling, and it says something quite shocking about what was going on, about the threat to the independence of the institution, which is why Mark Dreyfus is having to look at it now, because you can't really. It's very difficult to describe the AAT as an independent statutory authority anymore. You just can't.
With that level of political appointments.
Absolutely.
And I guess it is significant because if you take that long view and go all the way back to kind of the Howard government and the Labor government that followed that had a small and probably even in itself significant level of political appointments, but you know, perhaps you can see that in a context and see, well, 5%, I guess, you know, that's not great, but it's not terrible. But when you're jumping up to kind of 30-40% of appointments,
That's right. That's right.
amazing.
And it really does threaten the independent, or has threatened the independence of it. It's not an independent, you couldn't say it's an independent body anymore. And it's really important that our government institutions are seen to be independent and impartial. And that's one of the reasons why cronyism such an important issue, and it's such an important form of corruption, because it really does threaten our democracy.
Well, the Australian Institute has done a deep dive of every single appointment made to the tribunal since 1996.
Over the number of Liberal appointments to taxpayer-funded jobs.
The truth is, the jobs for the boys stuff, it's as old as the hills. And it's actually...
The government has turned the Administrative Appeals Tribunal into a private Liberal employment company.
What kind of qualifications are people who appointed to the AAT expected to have, given that they're doing a merits-based review and their word is final, essentially?
Yeah. So under the legislation, you are required to have either 5 years legal experience as a legal practitioner, or you can also have special skills or experience. Now, the problem is that clause about special skills or experience has let a whole raft of people to be able to be appointed who really don't have the qualifications and experience necessary to undertake the tasks required of them.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a loophole big enough to drive a truck through.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what's happened. And so while you have a large proportion of people who have got legal expertise and who meet that criteria, there's also many others who are just so far below an appropriate benchmark that it's to coin the phrase, it's not funny.
Yeah.
It's egregious what's gone on. There's people, for example, who been suggested that they can't use Microsoft Word properly, don't have skills to enable them to research things on the internet. So we're talking about people with some pretty low levels of experience, even for just any sort of office-based work. So the fact that some people like that have been appointed to such an important job is really quite scandalous.
And I think the research showed, correct me if I'm wrong, that about 10% of the political appointees had education levels below the level of a bachelor's degree, and that compared with only 2% of non-political appointees. So there's a big difference there.
That's right. And that's part of what's going on, is that these appointments are probably being done in order to affect what we call policy control, and that the government wants the people there, the political appointees there to make decisions in a way that they want them done. But also I suspect that what's going on here too are gifts. They're gifts to their political friends, basically, who are perhaps struggling to get work elsewhere.
And these aren't kind of minimum wage jobs, are they?
No, they're I think those people who are struggling at the moment in our society, and there's obviously very many of them, would love to get a pay packet like you receive at the AAT.
What are we talking there?
An ordinary member gets between $194,000 and $222,000. So that's quite a lot of money when you just don't have your skills are pretty low.
Yeah, that would put you in about the top 10% of income earners, I would think.
Yeah.
Just days out from the election being called, the Attorney General Michaelia Cash announced 19 new appointments to the tribunal, including former West Australian and New South Wales Liberal Minister.
I mean, I challenge you to point out which one of those 19 new appointments are not qualified.
Well, let's go through that if you want to raise that. If you raise that issue.
The 19 new appointments, Senator Carr, are legally qualified, including 8 barristers. I would argue that having those legally qualified people is an asset to the AAT.
Prue Goward, the former New South Wales Minister, what are her specific qualifications?
Well, in relation to Prue Goward, I mean, again, I think for her, her qualifications stand for herself, and in particular as someone who from 2001 to 2007 was incredibly well known across Australia. Ms Gow would, eminently qualified. Her record
for what?
stands.
Qualified for what?
Senator Carr, we're going to just stop.
Bill, that's pretty shocking research and alarming kind of how much it was ramping up as well. We know the Attorney General is conducting a review into the AAT's operations and whether or not it is fit for purpose. But a Senate committee also examined this matter earlier this year. What did it find?
So the Senate Legal Affairs Committee took a look at the administrative review processes in Australia, which is mostly the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And pretty disturbingly, they found that the current operation of the AAT undermines public trust in both the AAT and in effective public administration. That's pretty damning to my eyes. They had a chance to release an interim report before the federal election, and in that made a number of recommendations. One is to restore the Administrative Review Council. So under the AAT Act, there's actually this separate body which is meant to provide advice about public administration. And rather than amend the Act, the previous government just cut their funding and effectively abolished them that way. There's also a recommendation to fix the appointments process to the AAT, something that we've also recommended. Our recommendations go a bit further than what the committee was considering, but they're talking about things like having an independent process, having expressions of interest, publishing the results of the process, pretty basic things you'd expect from a body. But then the most substantial and noteworthy recommendation is actually to spill the AAT, to disassemble it, and to start over again. And when you have a Senate committee making a recommendation like that, I think it really goes to show the seriousness of what's happened to the AAT for it to lose the confidence of the Senate like that. It's worth noting that the coalition members of the committee published a dissenting report. They acknowledged some problems with the AAT, but they didn't sign on to those recommendations. The committee reformed briefly after the election, but basically to back in its interim report. They didn't expand on it. So that's the document that we have to work from.
Yeah, it's pretty substantial. Like, it's not every day a Senate committee recommends disassembling a whole statutory body and reforming it. It's pretty reasonable indication something's gone wrong there.
Is it appropriate Fiona Meagher, the daughter of former High Court Judge Ian Callanan, was promoted at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal without any interview or process while Mr Callanan was conducting a review of the organisation? Is it true Mr Callanan called you in late 2020 advocating for his daughter to be appointed to a 500k Deputy President role?
Look, I'm not aware of the matters that you're referring to. And I'm not aware of the call you're referring to. So I can't really offer much comment.
And Bill, I believe there's been a couple of other concerns raised by people in the legal fraternity since the election. What's that about?
Yeah, so last month it emerged that a couple of former judges are looking into a bunch of AAT appointments that were made in the last days of the Morrison government. And their concerns include whether the proper disclosures were made. It seems like who was actually appointed and the conditions of their appointment was posted late and with limited information, which has made it harder for them to track down the second part of the problem, which is that making those appointments when you're in a caretaker period could be a breach of constitutional conventions. You're not normally supposed to make future appointments when you're not going to be, or you may not be, the government in the future. And they give the example, we have a retiring High Court Chief Justice next year, and it wouldn't be appropriate for the Morrison government to have picked her replacement, a year in advance. That's the kind of concern that they've raised for some of these appointments. And if you think about, of course, we've got concerns about due process and who's on the tribunal and so on, but also if you're having a decision made by a tribunal member, you want to be sure that they're a properly appointed member and that there's no risk that their decision is going to be thrown into disarray if their appointment wasn't made correctly.
So potentially those judges were flagging concerns that if they weren't constitutionally appointed, then it could throw or cast doubt on decisions that they've made after that appointment.
That's right.
Yeah, that'd be scary if that you happen to draw that person in your particular NDIS case review or something like that, wouldn't it? So, Deb, I want to come back to you. How do we fix this? Obviously, there's a review underway. We're not quite sure what the Attorney General will do. The Senate committee has recommended disassembling the AAT and reforming it. How would you recommend that the Attorney General fix it?
I think it's really important that they basically scrap it and start again. It's there's no other way around it. It's because this current state is so dire. There are really no other options available. It's also really important going forward that there is a proper appointments process. And while various people have come up with ideas about that, I think one of the recommendations in the report that hasn't gotten a lot of attention to date is about the fact that really you shouldn't have people, you can't have a situation where you've just stepped out of public life as a political elected representative or an advisor and then straight on to the AAT. There's got to be some break. And so that's really important, and I haven't seen that. That's not being discussed at the moment, and I think that's really important to put that on the table, that we need to have exclusion periods, particularly in relation to bodies like the AAT, that at their very essence it's about them being independent and impartial. And you just can't have that situation where you can step from a highly political role straight on to the AAT.
We need people to feel that there is integrity at the heart of government in Australia. We need people to have confidence that the rule of law is being respected, that if they see something wrong happening, that they can complain about it, that if they complain about it, that it will be investigated and that action will happen.
Bill, what about you? Integrity was such a huge part of the election. We've seen the government kind of really within its first 6 months uphold its commitment to establish a National Anti-Corruption Commission. But you've also been looking at other democracy reforms to restore integrity to the parliament. Apart from that, things like truth in political advertising and other things. How important is this AAT review in terms of the overall political context in which we find ourselves, where people have lost trust in politics?
I think it's extremely important that we address a loss of or perceived loss of independence in a key body that's meant to test and reconsider the decisions made by government. There's a danger, I think, that the AAT gets treated as a bit technical and for that reason gets neglected compared to something like political advertisements, which every person sees and has an opinion on whether they're truthful or not. But the reality is that these are going to be life-affecting decisions for the people who are in front of the AAT. And it's also not even cheap to bring a case before the AAT. For us to have confidence in government, we need to know that their decisions are in accordance with the rule of law. And if you have pressure on the people who are doing those checks, you lose that. You also lose a bit of confidence even in those who aren't political appointees themselves, because you're aware of the pressures that must be on them as they see an increasing number of appointments and reappointments go to those with political connections. So I think there's been promising moves by the Attorney General. He has committed to a more independent and transparent appointments process. And you can see that by the fact that there's now a page for expressions of interest for AAT appointments on the Attorney General's page. If you think you're qualified, you can put your hand up and be tested against that, rather than, as we heard before, appointments kind of passing by word of mouth, being made to people with those connections. But ultimately, if we're going to arrest the loss in trust in Australian democracy, we're going to need fixes across the board, improvements to how Parliament operates, those reforms to fix misleading advertising among, in the election debate, as well as fixing up the AAT. It's not something we're going to address with just one body, although the NAC is a welcome addition, but it's something we're going to have to keep working at.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much, Bill and Deb. This episode was recorded on Wednesday the 12th of October, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including our AAT research report. And we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Bill Brown is at Brown90, that's Brown with an E, and Deb Wilkinson, sensibly, is not on Twitter. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.